The meadow was quiet when the first blade broke the earth. Mist curled low, not rising but folding inward like breath held too long. It moved through the rushes and clung to the ankles of the builders like memory. The dew was thick, silvering every blade of grass, every reed. In the pale hush before dawn, a single spade carved its arc downward into the softened ground, slow, ceremonial, final. Mare Alice did not speak. Her breath made clouds before her face as she knelt beside the young willow, cutting bark in slow strips, the knife whispering through green. Sap bled along her fingers and she welcomed it. It was warm, almost human, like the blood of the children she'd once caught in her arms, slick and shrieking beneath torchlight. The bark curled in her lap like shavings of something sacred. She laid it beside the roots she had twisted into loops, not just for structure but for warding. A quiet language made of circles and knots. Behind her, the rustle of skirts and reeds began. The village women stepping through frost-stiff grasses, their arms laden with straw and peat, clay caked on their boots. Their voices were hushed as though the air itself were listening. Somewhere a child sneezed. Somewhere a crow called once then fell silent. They had come because they had no choice. The old village was gone, swallowed by swollen rivers and a fever that turned skin purple and breath sour. There had been no time to bury properly. Alice still dreamed of the bodies, wrapped in linen piled high at the chapel doors, wax melting in the rain. And yet here they were, months later, standing in a hollow of reclaimed earth, ready to raise walls. Every post they drove into the mud was a resistance to grief. Alice whispered as she worked, not prayer, not incantation, but the old tongue her grandmother had spoken beneath wind and thatch, before the king's tongue took hold. Grow as we must, she told the willow bark. Hold what we build. Breathe for those who cannot. The scent of loam, sweat, and steam thickened as the sun rose, casting long amber streaks across the meadow. It lit the curve of tools left in the grass, the raw weave of early wattle walls, the bare backs of men lifting timber into upright silence. Then came Benoit, a young man with a quiet jaw and sun-cracked hands. A heifer plodded behind him, its coat brushed smooth, its breath rising in soft white curls. The yoke on its neck had been worn smooth by years of work, barley harvests, wood hauling, journeys to the edge of nowhere and back. He led the beast slowly to the center of the clearing, then stopped. He turned to Alice, nodded once, then knelt. The ritual was unspoken but understood. He guided the animal's hoof into the soft clay and pressed gently, letting the weight settle. The impression remained, not deep but true. It was a mark. A beginning. A binding. Alice watched as the boy stood again, his breath steady, his eyes on the framed sky above them. The heifer lowed and was led away. Silence held a moment longer. Then the hammers began. Mallets on oak posts. The hollow thud of beams seated into sockets dug with blood and bone. The rhythmic slap of hands smoothing straw against timber, the creak of rope wound tight, the sharp breath of a young girl who cut her hand weaving rushes but did not cry. By mid-afternoon, the skeleton of the first house stood. For beams like legs, upright and unyielding. The wattle was woven loosely still, like ribs waiting for flesh. Alice walked the edges slowly, her hand trailing the raw grain of the posts. The wood smelled green. Alive. Vulnerable. She stepped inside. The floor was nothing but earth, but it was warm beneath her feet, softened by the day's tread and sun. Her palm pressed against the central beam. A knot pulsed beneath her skin. Not magic, not omen. Just the stubbornness of trees refusing to forget the sky. The doorframe had no door yet. Just an opening. Wind moved through it, not strong but sure. She stood in that threshold and felt something loosen in her chest. It was not joy. Not yet. But something adjacent. A permission to begin again. Behind her, laughter rose, short and tired and real. A woman had dropped a basket of rushes and a child had kicked one, sending it skittering like a stick insect across the grass. For a moment, just a moment, there was no memory of the flood. Only the slap of bare feet, the squeal of delight, and a mother's mock scolding in a dialect thick with sun and survival. Alice let the sound move through her. Let it carry her back. She remembered the last child she helped into the world, a girl too small, lungs weak, but eyes alert as winter stars. She remembered the mother, gasping, bleeding, gripping her hand with such force Alice thought the bones would crack. The mother had died. The child had lived. She did not know where that child was now, somewhere, perhaps, among these woven beams. The sun dipped low. The final post was driven into place with a muffled knock, the sound carrying like a bell into the soft-bellied dusk. Shadows stretched long across the meadow. A fire was lit, small for cooking only, but it cast light onto the half-walls, painting them in motion. A crow passed overhead. Its wings beat twice before it turned, silhouetted black against gold. Alice followed its path, watching as it dipped over the tree-line and vanished. Behind her, the house waited. No roof, no hearth, but a place, a claim, a shape for living. She stepped from the threshold, back into grass bent with frost and footsteps. The wind tugged gently at her braid. Behind her, others stood watching, silent, reverent. Not for her. For the thing they had made. The house would hold them someday. Not just from rain but from forgetting. It would hold bread and tears and childbirth and death. It would soak in lullabies and warnings and promises. It would become a body, of timber, straw and soul. And for now it breathed, open to the sky. The first door was not yet closed. But it had been born. And in the hush of twilight, the meadow exhaled. The storm did not roar. It whispered, slow, steady like something old returning. Rain fell in threads, thin as hair, winding between thatched rooftops still damp with sap and lichen. Wind stirred the rushes, curled under door frames, breathed over the embers of last night's fire. And beneath the raw-boned sky, a boy chased a broken wheel down a slope, his laughter muffled by the wet wool of his hood. They had been in the village only weeks, and already the land had begun to shape them. The fields, newly cleared of briar and rock, lay like open skin, waiting. Here and there outlines of future furrows could be seen beneath the puddled earth, ghost traces of harvests yet to come. A path had been trodden between the stream and the half-raised barn, its ruts filling with rainwater and footprints. Horses had passed here and cattle. And boots, many boots, some worn smooth from years of pilgrimage, others new, cracked open by work alone. Within the frame of the barn a man stood, wide-shouldered, graying at the temples, his hands still caked in mortar and ash. He was called Gillum, once a soldier under a baron who no longer ruled. Now he shaped timber instead of war. His axe, blunted by use, hung at his hip like a relic. But his voice held command. Not shouted, just heard. He nodded once at a boy dragging an armful of wattles, then turned to the beam beside him. The bark had already been stripped, the wood scented sharp and green. With one practiced motion, Gillum braced it with a shoulder and guided it into place. A second man brought a peg. A woman hammered it in, 3 strikes, clean and even. Above them the roof supports creaked. Inside the shelter the air was rich with damp wool, hot breath and resin. A mother nursed her infant behind a canvas screen made of a torn cart cover. She whispered a lullaby from the coast, foreign syllables softened by tenderness. Beside her, an old man shaped spoons from beechwood, his knife dancing with quiet rhythm, the wood curls scattering like petals. These were not nobility. Not chosen. Not even safe. They were the ones who survived. The ones who walked away from flame or famine or flood, carrying with them little but memory, and a need to build something that would last. In the corner, leaning against the unfinished wall, sat a girl of perhaps 13. Her sleeves were too long, her eyes watchful. She twisted a cord of flax between her fingers, knotting it, unknotting it, over and over again. Each loop was the shape of a door. Each not a question. She would not speak until spoken to. She had been told her silence would serve her better than her voice. Outside, the rain slackened, and mist rose from the fields in soft steam. The last of the morning's oxen returned, their sides slick with mud, their handlers weary and cursing. But even the curses were routine now, worn like shoes. The language of work had returned to the village, syllable by syllable, the way one rebuilds a lost tongue. Midday came and the bell did not toll. There was no church, not yet. But someone struck iron against wood, and bowls were brought out, each carved from the same tree, smooth from years of palm and porridge. They ate in silence. Bread, dense and bitter with husk. Wild leeks boiled soft in clay pots. Salted fish, torn from the bone with teeth dulled by winter. One man offered up a dried apple from the old stores, and the children watched it pass as if it were gold. A bite each. Cheeks flushed, not from shame but the sweetness. It was not joy. But it was close. When the meal ended, the workers returned without command. Some to the frame. Others to the field. The girl with the flax cord was sent to gather thatch. She left without a word, her braid dark with rain. Gillum stayed behind to mark the timber. He used charcoal, dragging thick lines across the posts, each one a measure, not just of length but of intent. His father had taught him this, when villages were still held by oaths and stones. Now stones had crumbled. But the marks remained. A sparrow landed on the roof beam above, its feathers puffed against the cold. It chirped once then took flight. The girl returned with her arms full of dry thatch, soaked at the edges but usable. She dropped it near the wall, then paused. Her fingers reached into her pocket and withdrew a single object, a bone needle, carved by her grandmother. She rubbed it once for luck, then tucked it back away. Later that night, that same girl would stitch the first sleeping mat from woven hemp and dry moss. She would lay it on the earth floor of the barn beside her younger brother. And in the dark, she would whisper the names of the trees aloud, oak, ash, birch, as though calling the bones of the forest into the walls. The barn was not yet finished. The village barely formed. But the shape of things had begun. The posts stood and they held. The rain returned in the evening, gentler now, like something spent. Smoke curled from a hearth where there had been none. And beside it, two children slept with heads against the same folded cloak, their dreams silent but warm. Outside the land breathed. Not tamed. Not owned. But marked. And somewhere, just past the edge of firelight, the first fox watched from the bracken, its eyes catching the light. Not afraid. Not yet. Just curious. As the village settled into sleep, the flax cord hung by the door, tied now in a single knot, not tight but sure. The future had not come. But it had been invited. The ground opened not with violence but with reverence. They had found the old stones beneath layers of soil and moss, a low ring of crumbling rock nearly forgotten beneath the yew trees, remnants of an older world, an older worship. The villagers paused before them, silent, tools lowered, eyes uncertain. In the hush of midday the forest seemed to lean closer. It was Benoit, the same boy who led the heifer weeks before, who stepped into the circle first. He traced his fingers over the runes carved into a half-buried slab, worn smooth by centuries of wind and frost. He could not read them but he felt their weight. Something had been spoken here once. Promises. Warnings. Names. The elders debated what to do, build around it? Tear it down? But Mère Alice, who remembered stories her grandmother once whispered beneath a roof of peat and smoke, spoke softly, "Let the old roots hold the new." And so the circle remained. Not as shrine or altar, but as center. They built outward. With each passing day the village took shape in slow, aching gestures. Not grand but vital. A drainage ditch was dug, stones laid into the muddy banks to hold back spring floods. A grain pit was lined with ash and straw, sealed with clay. The forge was marked with a blackened crossbeam, its future heat only imagined for now. But it was the well that demanded the most. They chose the center of the meadow, not for symmetry but because a divining rod twitched there, held in the calloused hands of a girl who'd never seen a cathedral, but who knew when the earth held water. She had no name that lasted, only what the village called her, Sparrow. Sparrow worked silently beside Gillum and two other men, hauling stones, shaping the shaft. Day by day they lowered the rope, inch by inch, into the dark mouth of the earth. 4 weeks it returned dry, scraped with dust and silence. Until it didn't. One morning before dawn, Sparrow pulled and the rope came up slick, a sheen of moisture on the bucket's lip, a single drop trembling on the rim like a blessing. She said nothing. Only nodded. The men grinned. Gillum crossed himself. A boy ran to tell Alice. Water. Water. They celebrated with broth and hard bread, and a single apple split 7 ways. As the sun climbed, beams were laid over the granary trench. Wattle was soaked and twisted. Clay churned underfoot, thick with straw and sweat. Voices called in rhythm, mallets struck with song. It was not harmony, not yet, but it was music. Evenings settled slow. Smoke curled from 2 hearths now. Children's laughter returned, cautious as deer. Men mended boots. Women sewed linen sacks for grain. The sick lay beneath fir and nettle salves, their breath less ragged. Somewhere a flute played, reed and breath woven in solitude. And still the stones watched. Sparrow began laying offerings at their feet, bits of herbs, the feather of a crow, once even a twist of bread. Not pagan, not Christian, just old. Gillum built a bench beside the circle. He said nothing but sat there each dusk, his axe beside him, his boots heavy with earth. Once a week he'd leave a nail pressed into the stone's crack, iron for whatever gods might listen. The villagers spoke of building a chapel. But not yet. There were walls to finish, fences to mend, fields to sow. One night, thunder rolled over the horizon. The wind picked up, howling through the half-set rafters. Rain came sharp and cold, soaking through unfinished thatch. Chickens scattered. A cart tipped. And the fire in Alice's hut guttered out. They huddled, wet and shivering, beneath stretched canvas and wool cloaks. Alice moved from shelter to shelter, pressing warm stones into cold hands, murmuring songs in the tongue of her youth, half prayer, half memory. By morning the meadow was torn in patches. Mud swallowed tools. A beam had collapsed. But no one had died. And that mattered. They began again. With less haste now, more care. The wind had tested them. The earth had spoken. Sparrow returned to the stones that evening. She brushed away the leaves and set a small clay bowl at their center, filled with water from the new well. She waited. No voice came. But neither did silence. Only wind through rushes and the far cry of an owl overhead. When Alice joined her, she sat without speaking. The older woman set a strip of dyed cloth beside the bowl, red, the color of protection. Then Gillum came, and the boy with the broken wheel and the mother with the lullaby. One by one they came. Not to pray. Not yet. Just to remember. That villages are not born of land alone. They are shaped by story. By ritual. By the bones of what came before. The circle of stone remained. Not explained. Not feared. Just accepted. And at its center the bowl never emptied. As if something, someone, had decided to stay. The first frost came early that year. It swept across the half-planted fields like a white veil, settling on every thatched roof and bundle of drying flax. Beneath the cold breath of morning, breath turned to fog and hands cracked with blood and salt. The village was not yet ready. Its walls stood but they did not yet hold. Its earth was turned but not yet seeded. The hearths flickered but their warmth could not keep out the winter. In the still before dawn, a child named Call lay coughing in the crook of his mother's arm. His breath came in short, wet gasps. Outside their hut, a bramble of firewood stood damp and untouched. The kindling would not catch. His mother wept quietly, rocking, lips pressed to his brow. The breath of the hut was sour, damp wool, boiled onions, and something sweeter beneath. Something leaving. Mare Alice heard the crying before she reached the door. She knelt beside the boy and ran her thumb along his chest, listening not with ears but with memory. She unwrapped a satchel of nettle syrup, crushed dried pear in her palm, and whispered something over the boy's eyes. A rhyme from another village, long drowned. She was not sure it would help. But she gave it anyway. The winter had teeth. And it was hungry. Food stores had shrunk to brittle roots, dried apples, and smoked trout, strung on string like prayers. The villagers gathered in the longhouse to divide what remained. Bread baked with acorn flour. Porridge thinned with snowmelt. Gillum, whose hands once split trees, now turned them gently in the fire, coaxing each ember to stay alive just one more night. Still they did not curse the land. Instead they worked it. A trench was dug around the outer fence, not for war but for wind. Cold air curved low and thick, and this shallow ditch softened its bite. They sealed the cracks in every wall with clay and horse dung, pressed tight by children's fingers. And each hut was marked, quietly, with the cross of soot. Just in case. Benoit, who had grown silent since the heifer's death, now spent hours shaping firewood with a draw-knife, shaving curls into bundles, wrapping them in bark. He lined them beneath the eaves, careful as a monk laying parchment. Each piece dry. Each one precious. In the chapel still under construction, they gathered not for mass but for warmth. Sparrow lit the tallow candles one by one, her hands red and blistered from frost. The walls were bare, the roof patched with hide, but still they sang. Not hymns. Not always. Sometimes just humming. Sometimes just the sound of breath rising together, like the sigh of a forest in winter. No one asked where Call's mother had gone when she left the boy's side that night. But in the morning, the door of their hut was unlatched, and 2 loaves of warm bread rested at the threshold, steaming in the dawn like an answered prayer. No one spoke of it. But when the snow came harder the next week, 3 others left similar gifts at the same door. A strip of mutton. A wool scarf. A carved toy bird. Alice watched, always at a distance. Her eyes carried both blessing and burden. When one of the thatch roofs collapsed under the weight of ice, she was there, pulling reeds from the rubble, her hands raw and bleeding. "We build again," she murmured. Not to anyone. Just to the air. And they did. They built. Not just homes. But meaning. A young girl braided cord from flax fibers, stringing tiny bells into the weave. She hung them above doorways, where wind would catch them and chase away bad spirits. When asked why, she only said, "Because it's better than silence." And no one disagreed. The village, now 6 months old, no longer resembled the clearing it had been. Its paths had worn into the earth. Its roofs had darkened with soot. Its hands, young, old, trembling, strong, had learned how to hold one another through cold. Still the frost came. And so did the wolves. They circled at night, unseen but always felt. Once, Benoit spotted their prints near the henhouse. deep and wide. The hens were gone. That night, Gillum did not sleep. He stood at the gate with a spear made from the broken beam of the forge. The wind tried to blow out his torch, but he relit it again and again. The flame never left him. He was still there when the sun rose. And when it did, something shifted. The light struck the stones at the village center, the old circle, just right. A line of frost melted across one stone in the shape of a crescent. The villagers gathered quietly as they had before. Sparrow placed a sprig of dried holly between the cracks. No one said what they felt. But they stayed a while longer than usual. Later that day, a deer was spotted just beyond the trees. Alone. Limping. They watched it for hours before Alice gave the word. It fell with one arrow clean through the ribs. That night the entire village ate. They roasted its haunches with juniper and thyme, saved the marrow, smoked the strips, and stewed the rest in clay pots buried beneath the embers. Children danced. An old man told a story about a wolf who forgot its name. And a woman near the chapel sang a lullaby that no one had heard since before the flood. It was not joy. Not exactly. But it was the echo of it. And it was enough. In the dark beyond the firelight, the forest still whispered. The frost would return. The wolves would return. But so would spring. And for now that was the shape of faith. It was not stone walls or candle wax. Not psalms or salt lines. It was food shared without question. It was hands held in the dark. It was a bell hung in an unfinished chapel, ringing once, clear and small, into the frozen night. And somewhere in the silence that followed, the village heard itself. The sound came first, not of footsteps but of iron. A slow, dragging clatter over frozen earth. Like someone pulling a chain behind them or a blade too heavy for its owner. It echoed through the narrow lane between newly risen cottages, still damp from morning fog. Chickens scattered. A shutter creaked. And then he appeared. The stranger wore a monk's robe, patched at the elbows, frayed at the hem, though the belt he cinched it with was from a soldier's kit, leather, tooled, blood-stained. His beard was matted. His hands were black with old soot. And his eyes, set deep beneath the rim of his cowl, carried the gray stillness of someone who had stopped counting the days. He gave no name. Only a gesture, a raised palm toward the chapel, toward the well, toward the field. A gesture not of greeting but of asking. And so the village watched. Mare Alice, who had seen men break from war and plague alike, met him near the well and offered a cup of broth. He drank it slowly as if remembering how. Then he sat down on the stone edge and remained there until the sun passed overhead. Some thought he might be penitent, a monk seeking atonement for a vow broken or a soul lost. Others whispered of old crusades, of men who had crossed the sea for holy war and returned with silence instead of victory. But none asked. Instead they watched what he did. He found the forge, long abandoned after the blacksmith's son took sick and died. He cleaned it, quietly, purposefully. He stoked the coals with a practiced hand, his foot on the bellows, the wind inside the flames hissing like a sleeping beast. The anvil was still there, rusted yes but solid. A hammer lay beside it, untouched since summer. And then he began to work. Not with swords or horseshoes, but hinges, door latches, nails. He mended the gate that kept the goats from the grain. He fixed the hinges on Benoit's hut so they no longer screamed in the wind. He shaped iron hooks for lanterns, shaped so carefully they looked almost like vines curling upward toward light. And when someone brought him a rusted sickle from the last harvest, its blade eaten with time, he sharpened it until it whispered through wheat again. They never heard him speak. But he left messages in metal. He carved a spiral into the base of the chapel's door latch, the same spiral found on a stone far north, where druids once watched the sun move through standing stones. He fitted a new lock on the grain shed, shaped like a heart with 3 teeth. When Alice asked why, he looked at her and placed his hand over his chest, then turned away. In time, the forge became something more than heat and sparks. It became a rhythm. The tap of hammer. The hiss of water. The scent of ash and sweat and iron. It reminded the villagers of breath. Of life continuing. One night, just after the final bell had rung and the stars blinked through frost, the stranger placed a bundle in the chapel. A bell. Not large. Not ornate. Just smooth and round with a clapper of polished bone. He left it beneath the altar, wrapped in linen. The next morning no one saw him. Only the bell remained. Sparrow hung it herself just above the doorway. When the wind passed, it sang, clear, sharp, and sweet, like the cry of a child waking from dream. It marked no time. It called no sermon. But it sounded when the fire was low. When someone arrived with tears. When someone left without goodbye. The bell never stayed silent long. Gillam, who had once fought in the Lord's army and returned with scars too deep for fire to warm, took to tending the forge afterward. He spoke little, but he kept the coals alive. He hammered slow with reverence. And once, after a frost nearly claimed Benoit's foot, Gillam shaped a brace of iron, not for punishment but for healing. And the forge, once hollow, once filled only with the memory of death, became something else entirely. It became a place where stories could be reformed, where iron bent and broken could be shaped anew. So the village continued. Its walls held through the wind. Its hinges turned without shriek. Its fields, once planted by hand, now opened with tools that fit the land like a second skin. And always the bell above the chapel sang, not loud but certain. And every time it did, someone remembered the stranger. Not by name, not by tale, but by the silence he left behind, and the sound he gave in its place. Because in a village built from mud and memory, it was not the prayers that kept it standing. It was the iron beneath the wood, the hands that shaped it, and the choice again and again to begin, even when no one was watching. The rain came soft that morning, not as punishment, but as a kind of washing. Not yet storm, but not mercy either. It soaked the thatch, slicked the bare beams, and ran along the backs of men who labored without complaint. In the far corner of the village, where the path bent toward the woods, a group of children huddled under the half-eaves of an unfinished roof. Their laughter was subdued, half swallowed by the mist, but it was laughter still. Life hidden like fire under ash. There, in the shelter of damp timbers, stood Sorrel. Not yet woman, but no longer child. Her hair matted by rain. Her palms raw with the shape of tools. She had no mother now, the last fever had taken her in spring, but she held the recipe of the house in her hands. Wattles soaked, daub mixed, would cut to the handspan her father had once taught her. And she built. Not a hall. Not a chapel. But a hearth. She used river stones her brother had fished from the shallows, flat ones that caught the light. She pressed them into clay with her knees, whispering the names of seasons. Lent, harvest, Yule. Names her mother used when stirring porridge or stitching winter linen. Around her, men raised beams, and oxen dragged oak slabs up from the lower glade. But Sorrel worked in silence, lips pressed tight, brow furrowed like an old woman's. When the fire took, she did not smile. She only watched the flame rise, warm and yellow, licking the wet from the stones. She didn't need applause. She needed memory. And warmth. And for the ache in her chest to quiet, even just for a while. The others came then. Not to praise but to sit. One by one, women with pails, boys with bruised fingers, a man whose eye had turned white from an old wound. They settled near the fire like birds finding a branch. No one spoke. The heat spread slow like wine through a wound. That night, the village held its first meal indoors. Turnips and onions, boiled coarse in an iron pot hung from green forged hooks. Flatbread blackened at the edges. No meat, no spice. But it filled the mouth. It filled the hands. And it filled the hush with something like belonging. Sorrel passed bowls without looking up. She knew her place, not a leader, not a child. A builder of warmth. A weaver of silence. And outside, the rain became a hush against the roof. The next morning, the children brought scraps, feathers, river glass, a rusted comb. They handed them to Sorrel as if offering treasure. She arranged them on the mantel, a shrine to what was found, not what was lost. Her brother hung a strand of acorns on the doorframe. Someone carved the family rune into the lintel. The house was not just a house now. It was the first memory of shelter they had made since leaving the drowned valley. And soon others followed. Walls rose from planks and prayer. Doors hung. Bread ovens took form from stone and spit. And each new hearth echoed the first, not in shape but in soul. By midsummer the village had a rhythm. Morning mist, midday labor, evening hush. A candle in every window. A fire in every hearth. And every evening, when the smoke curled through the beams and the animals bedded down, Sorrel stepped into the open air, just past the threshold. She never stayed inside once the eating was done. She stood barefoot in the clay, the stars stitched above her like forgotten stitches in her mother's hem. She watched the firelight from the other houses, flickering like tiny suns. And she waited. For what, she never said. Perhaps for the day someone else would light the fire. Perhaps just to remember that not long ago there was no roof, no bread, no fire at all. Only earth. Only water. Only the will to begin again. In her hand she carried a single river stone. Flat, gray-blue, flecked with white. She pressed it to the beam beside her door, sealing it with silence. It was not a name. It was not a blessing. It was a marker. Of survival. Of beginning. of the girl who built the hearth that warmed the village's first night. And when winter came, hard and long, the fire in Sorrel's hearth never went out. Because in every story of kingdoms and castles, there must be a moment before them all, when someone somewhere knelt in the mud and built the fire that let them dream. It began with a whisper in the trees, a wind not yet born pressing through black branches like a breath. The forest watched, silent, ancient, indifferent. And at its edge, in the silver hour before sunrise, a boy named Ansel cut the first trail. His boots were stolen, one too large, the other split at the toe, and his coat was stitched from scraps of sheep felt, brittle from last year's frost. But his hands were steady. In them, an iron axe passed down from a father whose grave was lost in the flooded valley below. The blade bit deep into ashwood, and each swing echoed through the forest like a challenge. The trees had stood for centuries. They did not fall easily. Behind him, others waited. Not soldiers. Not kings. Just villagers. Old men with crooked backs. Young girls with baskets of rope. Widows with no sons. Together they stepped into the woods like pilgrims crossing into scripture, not with faith but necessity. Ansel cleared the way. The path would wind toward the quarry where granite teeth jutted from the earth. It would pass the moss-slicked stones where wolves once hunted, and curve around the old monastic well, its waters cold and clean as legend. It was not just a road. It was a spine. The new village would need stone. And to bring stone they would need wagons. And to bring wagons they would need a road. And so they cut. Axes. Shovels. Hands. The ground fought back, roots like bones, frost like iron, clay like grief. But they did not stop. For each step forward was a step away from the rot of the old land. The old village was gone. Swallowed by river and sickness and memory. This new one would be born through labor. At midday Ansel found a tree that would not fall. Tall. Proud. Blackened at the base from lightning struck long ago. He rested his palm on its bark, feeling the warmth still caught beneath its skin. A sign. Or a warning. Either way he left it standing. And the villagers moved around it, silently agreeing. Some things are not meant to be taken. By dusk they had reached the quarry's edge. The wind blew colder here, freer, unfiltered by tree or hedge. It carried the scent of flint and hawthorn, and the distant moan of an ox far behind. They laid the first markers. Chalk stones. Bundled twine. Knotted birch. And then they rested. Their fire was modest. Bark smoke. Half-burnt pine. A pot of nettle stew brewed on flat stone. But around it, a circle formed, boots to the flames, backs to the dark. And for a moment the quarry didn't feel like death. It felt like preparation. Ansel, knees scraped, hands blistered, stared into the embers. He had spoken little since the flood. Had not cried when his uncle drowned. Had not prayed when the church bell rang underwater. But here, among stone and silence, his breath caught in his chest. Not grief. Not joy. Something older. The others began to hum, wordless, a tune from before the fall. It traveled through the air like dust, light but clinging. A hymn for no god in particular. A song for the act of becoming. In the weeks that followed, the road grew. Marked by wheels. Flattened by passage. Its edges worn smooth by the repetition of purpose. And along it came stone. Granite. Slate. Chalk. Hauled on wagons rebuilt from fence posts and cart wheels bound with wet leather. The villagers stacked it in careful rows near the meadow, where the first frames of houses had already begun. Ansel walked the path daily now, no longer just a boy but something else, a keeper of routes. A knower of edges. He carried a bundle of hazel rods over one shoulder, marked with red string and charcoal rings. He was building fences now. Borders. The invisible lines that would soon become fields, ownership, belonging. One morning, a hawk circled above as he placed a final rod into the ground. The bird called once, sharp, sudden. And Ansel looked up. He did not know if it was blessing or omen. But in the space between its wings, he saw the pattern of the village emerging. Not in full, but in shape. Paths like veins. Hearths like hearts. A body taking form. The road he had carved was no longer just dirt. It was memory embedded in earth. A scar of purpose. A promise of return. That evening, as he reached the center of the meadow, a girl offered him bread baked on a flat stone. It was hard at the corners. Saltless. But warm. He took it. Ate slowly. Said nothing. And when he wiped the crumbs from his fingers, he saw the stone piles rising. There would be walls soon. There would be homes. And beyond them, the road would vanish into the trees once more. Waiting. For the next soul to walk it. For the next need to be answered. And beneath it all, Mud, ash, and labor, the story would settle like silt. Unseen. But eternal.